Today, I'll be continuing the read on The Grand Escape. Some people have told me I'm a bit monotone. Some tell me I'm a bit quiet. Some tell me I should stop. But I do take some of those into consideration. Like me being monotone and quiet. But not when people tell me to stop. That just makes me want to do more. So, without any more further delay, let's get into the story of The Grand Escape. Chapter 22. On the morning of August 5th, hidden in the stretch of woods outside Lathrin and beyond the Ems River, Gray, Kennard, and Blaine had their last meal. Some Horlicks tablets, a mix of dried milk, barley, and wheat. Other than a couple squares of chocolate each, they were completely out of food. To warm them, Blaine served out a few ounces of cognac left in his flask. They had long since smoked their last cigarettes, but their spirits offered some relief, before the rising chatter of birds in the trees signaled that it was time to sleep. At twilight, Gray spread out the last remaining section of his map. There was reason enough to be encouraged. He sensed his partner's spirits needed boosting, maybe even his own. There were no major roads to cross, and only a few small hamlets to circumvent along their path. Almost due west, on a map, the Emaphorius form resenting the Walchema Moor separated them from Holland, 8 miles away. A single night's march, and they would be across the line, enjoying a hearty breakfast. Or, if things went the other way, they might be shot trying to cross. The three airmen soon fell into the maw of the Welshmar. They trudged through its narrow channels, across islands of peat, and into the hollows that were waist deep with fetid waters. Each step was unsure. Their boots almost always either in a stream or buried in sticky mud. They slipped and stumbled, floundered backwards, sideways, every which way. Often it was impossible to move forward without leaning on one another, or asking for a hand or a yank at the rucksack. Night crawlers slithered underneath their clothes, and clouds of insects swarmed around them. If their men had known more about the Werkmart, they would have circumvented its clutches, for sure. Hour after hour, they struggled through, never on a straight compass line. Rain pelted down, mixing with the sweat in their eyes, and the sky was black. After 14 nights of marching, the previous 2 on a little more nibbles of chocolate, their bodies had no reservoirs of strength to reserve. What kept them going? Many things. The shame, unwanted though it was, of being shot down and captured. Imprisonment, in one camp after another, months, years, stolen from their lives. The separations from their squadrons and families. The narrow escapes, the recaptures, solitary confinement, sometimes pushed to the brink of madness and death. Holzimont, its petty annoyances, its waiting, its drumbeat of theft and deprivation, the endless hours of tunneling, the terror of the dark, the fear of collapse and suffocating in the bowels of the earth, all the setbacks and stubborn effort, and Neymar, his venomous hinges, his never-ending abuses. The thought of Neymar, of besting him, was reason enough to continue. Above all, they wanted to be free, to be masters of their own lives again, to simply take a walk when and where they pleased. It was approaching 4 a.m. on August 6th when Gray spotted a string of faint lights ahead. There was no towns nearby to explain their presence. Unless they trekked off so far off the line, they had to be arc lamps illuminating the border. The first blush of dawn would soon appear, and they needed to be across the frontier before then. They crept slowly through the moor, feeling the stir of danger enlivening their bodies. The rain muffled their movements, but they made sure not to cough or splash in puddles underfoot. Soon, they were close enough to see a high dike, and on top of it, individual lamps hanging on posts, equally separated 200 yards. German sentries paced back and forth between the posts, silhouetted by the light. They discovered that the dike was a sloped wall of mud and grass roughly 12 feet high. Backs flat against it, hidden from the sentry patrolling above, They took a few minutes to calm themselves and to ease their breathing. Then they started to watch the guard's routine, how long it took him to walk from one post to another, how long his eyes would be turned away from them, whether he made any pauses along the way. Unable to see beyond the embankment, they had to take faith that it would be a continuation of the moor. Once, over the top, Gray whispered, they would have to run as fast as they could through the bog. Only the darkness would protect them. The guard paced away from their position, and Kennard tried to climb the dike first, digging the tips of his boots into the wall, grasping some branches of short grass in his hands. He made a few feet up before slipping down. His next attempt had the same result, and for an instant they feared the embankment might be insurmountable. Then Gray had an idea. Bracing his back against the wall, he threaded his fingers together, palms up, and told Kennard to step into the hole. This he did, and with a quick jerk, Gray launched him up against the embankment. Kennard gave him some purchase, enough to get his feet on Gray's shoulder to stop himself sliding down. Suppressing a grunt as Kennard bore down on him, cupped Gray's hands together again and heaved Blaine up the same way. Blaine then used Kennard as a ladder to clamber up to the top of the embankment. At that moment, the sentry turned and came forward towards them. Blaine pressed himself against the edge of the dike wall. Fingers clawed into the mud, trying to keep himself from tumbling backward. Kennard supported him well, with Gray holding up the human ladder as the bottom on already exhausted legs. The sentry turned again, passing close enough to kick gravel down on top of them, but Blaine remained unseen. After a short countdown, fearing Gray might buckle at any second, Blaine scrambled up onto the gravel track that ran along the top of the embankment. As the sentry distanced himself, Blaine yanked Kennard up to his side. Now they had to get Gray up before the German turned. Forming a chain, Blaine at the top, grasping Kennard by the legs, they leaned over the embankment and reached for Gray. Desperate as he was to reach them, his boots slipped on the mud like it was slushy ice. Every attempt he made to mount the few feet he needed to grasp Kennard by the hand ended in a tumble down to the dark moor. Gray spotted that the sentry was about to turn back in their direction. "Duck!" he warned. Blaine and Kennard slithered off the gravel track and clung to the edge of the embankment. With every second that passed, their fingers were losing the strength they needed to keep their hold. Both kicked their boots into the wall for support, only to create a tumble of mud that splashed down into the puddles below. They were sure that they were lost at that moment, but the sentry continued on his beat, and Blaine and Kennard climbed back up onto the track. Gray had one more idea. If it didn't work, they would have to go on without him. Kennard stretched down to Blaine as he tightly held onto his legs. Gray tied together the straps of the two rucksacks, his own and the one Blaine had left behind. "Catch!" he hissed. He burst up the wall, throwing the bundle up at the same time. Holding its end tightly, Kennard grabbed the bundle and hauled Gray up the side of the wall. Blaine heaved them both onto the embankment. At last, Gray scrambled to the top, and the three sat gasping on the track. They could go on together. The trio had barely realized that they had been successful when they heard the German sentry yelling and saw him start to come towards them. "Run!" Gray shouted. "Down the bank! Run!" They leaped over the side of the dike, tumbling and sliding until they hit the bottom. Then they hurled themselves blindly out across the moor. Rifle shots rang out behind them, followed by curses and shouts in German. The sentry was aiming at shadows in the dark and missed. They rushed on across the uneven terrain until the sentry's threats faded behind them. Then they slowed, but they kept moving until Gray was sure they were well out of the range and far over the border. He drew to a halt, and Blaine and Kennard stopped beside him. "It's all over," Gray said, throwing an arm around each of their shoulders. "We bloody made it! We bloody well made it!" Together they yawped, leaping up and down, hollered and splashed in the marshy moon like schoolchildren in a puddle. In all his young life, Blaine had never experienced such joy. It overwhelmed him. Kennard felt the same. He sat down on some grass and ate the last sliver of chocolate, which he had saved to celebrate, if they'd made their home run. Then he wept. "That, dear friends, and fellow lunatics, is the Dutch village of Sellington," Gray said, looking northward at the halo of lights. Then he returned to his usual restrained self and rallied them to their feet. "Come on, then. Let's not waste any time. There's a war on, you know." Outside Sellington, Blaine, Kennard, and Gray surrendered to the first patrol they could find. The Dutch soldiers received the three of them, as if they were honored guests, and took them to the nearby town of Coviden. Put up in the top-class accommodations at the Hotel Van Wey, they ate, shed their filthy clothes, bathed, and shaved. Then they collapsed into their beds that must have felt like clouds. The next day, they telegrammed their families. The notes were spare but glorious. Kennard read, "Escaped and arrived safely in Holland. Expect me home shortly. Casper." The three other Holzman escapees, John, Toulouse, Stanley, Perseus, and Elbert Leggett, RRFC, joined them at the hotel the next day. The six had photographs taken, wearing wooden clogs together, with the owner of the hotel, though their faces were gaunt from malnourishment. They all wore the looks of conquering heroes. Soon after, the Dutch military escorted them by train to Eschweiler, where they were idled for a week in quarantine, segregated from the large contingent of German deserters. Bernhardt and Campbell Martin met them there soon after, including Rathbone, who had already gone ahead to England, and Lieutenant John Keith Busford. 10 of the 29 who escaped from Holzheim made it to Holland. It was his greatest escape of the war. Secret cables from the British consulate in Rotterdam informed London, where Lord Newton and officials in the War Office, military intelligence, and the Air Ministry celebrated the triumph. Even before the escaped officers left the quarantine camp, brief reports about the tunnel escapes were hitting newspapers across Europe and in the United States. The New York Times headlined, "British prisoners dig out," but offered few details since the sensational nature of the breakout had yet to be fully revealed. On the evening of August 15, the Holzheim escapees boarded a small ship in Rotterdam. They had new clothes, temporary passports, and a pocket full of money for their journey to London. As part of the large convoy escorted by destroyers, the ship pulled out of the Dutch harbor and traveled a circuitous route across the channel. The following morning, the officers were moved beyond words by the sight of the English shoreline. They docked soon after in Gravesend, from the window of their train to London. Gray watched the countryside pass. It all looked like it always had. The rise and fall of fields, bordered by hedges, cows lazing in the sun, towns tucked into hollows. Although he and the others had received updates about the war's progress, including the renewed Allied offensive that began only a week before, they still feared that their homeland had been ground down into a hopeless state, as German propaganda had promised for years now. Arriving at the station, they found the platforms crowded with young men in uniform. Outside, buses and taxis crammed the streets. Pedestrians thronged the sidewalks. Shops were open and restaurants bustling. To their quiet relief, Britain was alive and eager still. Dispatched straight to the War Office, the men underwent a series of interviews, mostly run by the intelligence department, to learn about their experiences and what they had seen during their captivity in Germany. Gray delivered his report of the prisoner abuses from earlier in the war. Then, as one escapee recorded that they were instructed to take 3 months' leave and get fat. Before there was any meat on their bones, King George V invited them for a private audience at Windsor Palace, then sent a kind of personal note to each officer. Blaine's read as follows: "The Queen joins me in welcoming you on your release from the miseries and hardships which you have endured with so much patience and courage. During these many months of trial, the early rescue of our gallant officers and men from the cruelties and captivity has been upmost in our thoughts. We are thankful that this longed for this day arrived, and that back in the old country you will be able once more to enjoy the happiness of a home and see good days among those who anxiously look for your return." As the tunnelers returned with their families, reports of their breakout spread. Now that the details could be revealed, their exploits captivated the nation and the world. "The Tunnel to Freedom. British officers escaped from the German Black Hole," said headlines in the Daily Sketch. "Daring escape," echoed the evening press, in bold. With so much sacrifice and honor on every front, the Holzheim escape was a bright banter of hope, not to mention proof of British daring do. The 10 men were put up for military cross medals. Despite all the attention the Holzheim breakout artists got, most of them simply wanted to get back into the fight. As soon as the leaves were over, Gray and his fellow pilots, Blaine, Kennard, returned to their duties. They had a war to win. Chapter 23. In the period of receiving Rathbone's telegram, Namor seemed to go abruptly mad. Whether it was because of shame over the mass escape or too much drink, he had become untethered. He raged at his charges like he'd never before, accusing them of insurrection. He fired off a revolver in the air at the slightest provocation. He stabbed his cane at the laundry the prisoners hung from the wire fences. The sight that one officer likened to Don Quixote tilling his lance at windmills. Continued escape attempts, mostly by cutting the wire, only throttled up his temper even more. As he threatened to do before, Neymar court-martialed the 19 recaptured prisoners. On September 27th, officials from Berlin arrived at Holzheim to hold the trial there. The defendants were charged with mutiny and with conspiring to destroy imperial government property, deciding that the indictment was a farce. Some of the officers gave suitable false answers to questions about the name, rank, religion, and pre-war occupation. One declared himself a shepherd, others a diamond trader, a grammar school pupil, a peasanier. The judges sentenced Slot to 6 months of solitary confinement in a prison fortress for having made an escape by force with united forces. But with 250,000 American troops landing in France every month, Allied advances puncturing holes in the trench lines across the Western Front, mass desertions of German soldiers, and the civil unrest in Berlin and elsewhere. The war prompted to be over before they could serve even a fraction of that sentence. Negotiations for an armistice was already in the works. Within days of the court-martial, Neymar suddenly turned into the prisoner's friend. He ordered a photographer to come into Holzheim and make clumsy attempts to joke with the men and gather them in happy groups for shots. They would all be home for Christmas, he promised. No longer did he bluster around the yard, cock of the walk. He stayed mostly in the Kommandantur, inviting the senior British officer Stokes Roberts to his office, approving most requests. For free roll calls, longer parole walks, whatever the men wanted. Neymar was aware that the British authorities knew all about his activities at Holzheim, Lord Newton having once demanded his removal, and he feared being tied to war crimes. When some prisoners warned him that justice would come calling, he claimed that he had always done all he could for the officers, and that if there could have been any unpleasant orders, they came from above. On November 11th, the armistice was announced, along with the news that Kaiser Wilhelm II had fled to the Netherlands, his rule over Germany at an end. Throughout the camp, portraits of Kaiser disappeared. The prisoners tossed their caps in the air. They cheered and danced in the Spielplatz and removed the German flag that flew from Block A. They freed those still in solitary cells and drank and feasted and partied into the wee hours of the night. Neither the guards or Neymar tried to stop them. In fact, Neymar immediately shed his uniform for a plain suit and declared to the camp, "You see, I am no longer a Prussian officer, but a Hanoverian gentleman." He had good reason to be worried. Socialist revolutionaries had already assassinated Heinrich. The following day, while the officers and orderlies at Holzheim wondered how and when they would return home, Neymar disappeared, no doubt with the riches he had extorted from them. Most of the guards fled as well. A company of German soldiers were sent to watch over the camp, but they largely allowed the men to do whatever they liked. Dick Cash was among many of those who used the new freedom to take walks into town. Holzheim's residents were in a desperate state and nearly rushed him when he presented packages of rice and tins of coca for trade. Of rice and tin. I haven't problems with these. Many were starving, and the Spanish flu, a pandemic that would affect 500 million people worldwide, was beginning to claim lives. Weeks passed without words of their fate, and the prisoners' supply of food was soon dwindled down to potatoes and cabbages. The Germans handed out pamphlets sent from Berlin, entitled A Parting Word. They began, "The war is over. A little while you will see your native land again." The propaganda promised a new Germany and concluded, "The valiant dead who once fought against each other have long been sleeping as comrades side by side in the same earth. May the living who once fought against each other labor at comrades' sides, side by side upon this self-shame earth. That is the message in which we bid you farewell." Yet this farewell did not come any closer. Eventually, Stokes Roberts commandeered a train to take the Holzheim men west. On the night of the departure, December 10th, they piled boxes, tables, chairs, trunks, old clothes, and anything else they could find that might be combustible into the spilt supplies and lit a huge bonfire. The German soldiers tried to extinguish the flames, but the British poked holes in their fire hoses. Framed by the glow of the blaze, they assembled into 4 columns and marched out of the gates. In Holzheim town, the Germans lined the streets to watch them pass, a look of awe, envy, and hate on their faces. One officer wrote, "The officers and orderlies boarded the train, making no separation for rank as they packed the carriages. With jolt, they started down the rails, the bonfire at Holzheim growing fainter in the distance with each passing minute, until they could see it no more." Epilogue. 20 years after the Holzheim escape, on the evening of July 23rd, 1938, Lieutenant Colonel David Gray, commanding officer of the 48th Pioneers, headed down London's Fleet Street and ducked through the door of the Ye Old Shire Cheese, the pub that over the centuries had welcomed Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Charles Dickens to drink under its dark, vaulted ceilings. This night, it was holding the 20th anniversary of the Holzheim tunnel escape. Air Commodore Charles Rathbone chaired the dinner, and James Bennett was its organizer. Sadly, Gray's 2 closest friends from the time were not there. In early 1919, Cecil Blaine had crashed and died while test piloting a Sopwith Dolphin with the RAF. He had been writing a memoir about the Holzheim escape. Gray was stationed in Russia at the time, fighting the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. It could not return for the funeral. King George V had sent his condolences to the Blaine family, recalling the gallant and able officer he had met only months before. So too did Gray miss the burial of Caspar Kennard. After the war, Kennard had gone home to Argentina, where he married and became the manager of a large ranch. In 1935, he was killed in a freak shooting accident. Kennard was a stout fellow, a good pal, his obituary concluded. His untimely death will leave a feeling of great regret in the hearts of his fellow officers. There were many others missing at that dinner. Albeit because of distance rather than tragic circumstances. Dick Cash had returned to Australia to reunite with his family, and after the armistice, the Holzheim prisoners had spread out far and wide, from South Africa to New Zealand, to Singapore, India, Hong Kong, Barbados, Vancouver, and New York City. Those absent were recognized and remembered, but most of the evening was spent in laughter and conversation, recalling the moments both comedic and horrifying they shared while tunneling to their freedom. The breakout artists still wonder about the fate of Karl Nehammer. At the Versailles Peace Conference, it had been agreed that certain enemy officers should be brought to justice for their crimes. Nehammer made the list, particularly after the death of William Lafayette Robinson, from the provisions he had suffered at Holzheim. However, Nehammer was never found. One report had him committing suicide in Hanover. Others said that he escaped to South America. Whether the truth, perhaps the best laugh of the evening, came when a mocked-up telegram from one of his fellow prisoners was delivered to the pub from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. "I know damn all you and your dinner," stopped Charles Nehammer. The roars of laughter from Gray and the others were heard in the night. Over the next few decades, the tunnelers and the other Nehammer prisoners, friends for life, would meet again for anniversaries. Gray, however, would not attend another of these dinners. When he had to leave the RAF in 1942, for reasons of age, he signed up for the Home Guard, a voluntary defense organization. That November, he died in a lorry accident. An inglorious end to an otherwise glorious and bravely led life. David Munchie Gray, the father of the tunnel, was buried with the honors in Wanston, Hampshire. Most treasured among the items he left his wife, Violet, and their 19-year-old son were the escape kit, the old maps, fake identification, and a compass he had used in his home run from Holzheim POW camp. The Holzheim escape had an impact far beyond those involved in its success. During World War II, Jim Bennett worked for MI9, a newly founded top-secret organization within British military intelligence, the purpose of which was to teach principles on evasion and escape to Allied soldiers, airmen, and Navy personnel. For this, it called upon the first-hand experiences of those who escaped the Germans in World War I, of which Bennett, as a Holzheim breakout artist, was an ideal example. Bennett usually begins his talk by saying that becoming a POW was improbable but possible. If taken prisoner, he advised the young men, "Your war effort is not finished." Every single one of them had a duty to escape. Britain needed them back in their ranks, and an escape would absorb men and resources that would otherwise be used on the front line. They might suffer mental and physical deprivation, but they were to remember that the war effort was by no means done. Bennett detailed escape routes from Germany and explained how to create a simple code for secret messages. He stressed that they need to stay fit during captivity and the importance of having a compass in order to reach the border. Then he recounted his own experiences, his lack of preparation, the missed opportunities, the false starts, all before his final dash across the border. In his mistakes and those of his friends, there was much to learn. "Forewarned and is forearmed," he liked to conclude. Bernhardt played only a small part in the vast organization that coordinated escape and evasion across Europe and the Mediterranean. But he and his fellow Breca artists, Gray, Blaine, Kennard, Rathborne, Leggett, Melcott, and so many others, were very much the inspiration for MI9 and its American counterpart, MISX. The bravery and the daring paved the way for their establishment. Given the Nazi penchant for torturing and sometimes hanging prisoners of war, these two organizations ended up saving many lives. In one historian's estimate, there were 192,848 British and Empire POWs held in Germany during World War I. Among those, there was over 10,000 escaped attempts, which only 573, 54 officers, 519 other ranks, were successful. In contrast, before the collapse of the Nazi Germany in 1945, 33,578 British, Commonwealth, and American POWs managed to return to the Allied lines after finding themselves captured by the enemy. Some of those was the most daring escapes, including those Colditz and Stag-Luft III, bear too many resemblance to the Great Escape from Holzheim to be a coincidence. Bernhardt never spoke much about his captivity or escape. His family had no idea about his subsequent service in World War II until they found a dusty folder with papers that concluded his speech notes and travel receipts after his death in 1983, at the ripe old age of 91. Instead, he focused his life on building a business, being a good friend, investing in a happy marriage, and raising a son and daughter. He was there to ensure that his children, Graham and Laurie, followed his version of the Golden Rule. Do as you would be done by, and to teach them how to ride a bicycle and drive a car. The opportunity to do so in freedom in his own country was reward enough for his contribution to the great escape of the Great War. Bernhardt's lecture notes during World War II for the Allied officers, his final words: "Escape as soon as possible. Coming down in enemy territory, choose a quiet spot, burn all papers and plane, evade capture, no luck, capture's interrogation, journey to POW camp, life in concentration camp, escape as soon as possible." The Holzheim Escape List, July 23rd to 24, 1918. Succeeded in home run: Jim Bennett, Cecil Blaine, John Boosfield, Peter Campbell Martin, David Gray, Caspar Kennard, Edward Leggett, Stanley Purves, Charles Rathbone, John Toulis. Recaptured: Douglas Birch, Thomas Burrell, Walter Butler, Andrew Colston, Frederick Lillingsworth, William Langreth, Colin Lawrence, Bernard Luthgren, Peter Lyon, Neil MacLeod, Frederick Murdoch, Arthur Morris, Jack Morrow, Robert Pattinson, Cliff Robertson, Frank Sharp, Alan Shipwright, Phil Smith, David Wright. Sources and acknowledgments. Years ago, in the Mirror's Adventures of a Lifetime, I took some flying lessons with a fellow author and experienced pilot, Tom Casey. I still vividly remember the exhilaration, the heart-dropping fear of swooping over the coastlines of Long Island, then around the tip of Manhattan, and up the Hudson River corridor. The experience sparked an interest in aviation, pursued more safely from the confines of histories of the same. My most avid reading focused on the early days of the RFC, and daring Oxbridge sorts, which made its early ranks of pilots flying in the wood, cloth, and wire contraptions. Among these volumes that inspired further reading were H.A. Jones' Magic Material, The War in the Air, Cecil Lewis' Sagittarius Rising, and Dennis Winters in the first of the few. Besides a hasty path to death, these pilots also faced a good chance of being shot down behind enemy lines, particularly as their activities ramped up in the advance of the Battle of Somme in 1916. Those who survived a crash landing were inevitably captured and imprisoned by the Germans, rascals of the highest sort. Many of those men attempted elaborate escapes that might as well have been pulled straight from the books pages of Boy's Own Adventures. Only the incursions could then resist picking up one of what became an ove of World War I, breakout memoirs. There are too many to name, but among my early favorites were Gerald Knight's Brother Botch, J.A.L. Cantor's 13 Days, A.J. Evans' Escaping Club, and J.L. Hardy's I Escape, Time and Again. These memoirs drew a line to what might be described as the Alcatraz of Germany at the time, Holzheim. I quickly fell into the spell of the classics, The Tunnel of Holzheim by H.G. Dunford, who played a big part in the extraordinary events that led to the greatest breakout of the Great War. Upon consuming his memoir, I was sure I had my new book project in hand. That said, Dunford recounted the events and characters of those involved, with some kind of emotionless British reserve that left me unsure of who these men were or what drove them. Then I came across the delightfully introspective, quirky, and beautiful written Comrades in Captivity by poet and Holzheim survivor R. F. W. Harvey. He put flesh and bone onto what was to be a prisoner in the archipelago of German camps, and the desperation that pushed some to risk everything to be free. All these books were inspiration and great source material, but they were only the beginning of my journey to chronicle this narrative. One should always start with the low-hanging fruit, and I benefited from 3 earlier works of Holzheim Escape, Beyond the Tumult by Barry Winchester, Escape from Germany by Neil Hansen, and Jacqueline Cook's The Real Great Escape. Each in their own way provide excellent guidance, same as the Holderstadt of British POWs in Germany by John Lewis Stemple in The War Behind the War. Given these events occurred exactly a century before I started my research, I knew first-hand interviews were out, and I would need to depend on a rich and diverse range of primary documents. Fortunately, I struck gold early, and often over the course of my project, thanks to many wonderful archivists at the Imperial War Museum, RAF Museum, the British National Archives at Kew, a treasure almost unparalleled, the Burgkirchev, in the Lido collection of University of Leeds. They provide unpublished memoirs, oral history interviews, repatriated POW reports, letters and maps, and even artifacts from the escape by many of the key participants in the extraordinary events. Of particular note was a handwritten memoir by Cecil Blaine at the Imperial War Museum. My frontline research was many of these finds was Claire Barrett. At the time, she was studying for her Master's in History of War from King's College, London. She proved tedious and a quick study, and I owe a great debt to her for following up on my leads and generating quite a few on her own. In a word, she is top-notch. Thanks also to the early research of Norma Bowman and Alma Schofield. I would also like to make a special call out to F. W. Harvey collection at the Guggenstein Archives. They hold an absolute treasure trove of letters, scrapbooks, personal documents, notebooks, and other papers from the soldier poet. If nothing else from this book, I am proud to have played a part in resurrecting the memoir of this incredible individual. I am also assisted in accessing this collection by James Grant Rapshire and Steve Cooper, the representatives both from the F. W. Harvey Society. Thank you also to Miss Elaine Jackson of the Harvey family, who gave me permission to quote from the collection. It is truly a window into the soul of these heroes. Wherein archives came up short, I depended on the kindness and generosity of the families of many of the principal individuals in this escape. After so many years, some were a challenge to track down across the world. Online family trees and Facebook are a researcher's new best friend. but perseverance paid off in the shades. Much of the individual story of the Royal Navy Air Service observer Leonard James Bennett had been lost to history, but thanks to his daughter, Lauren Vaughton, I had access to his unpublished memoirs, notes from lectures, and page after page of letters he sent from Holzheim during his captivity. More important in some ways, Bennett verified the link between the breakout arms of World War I and the founding of MI9, the British Escape and Evasion Service that saved so many lives during World War II. We would also like to thank Laurie's granddaughter, Lily Burchett, who collected many of these writings in her graduate school project, Home, this afternoon. Many other families assisted with letters, unpublished memoirs, photos, and other bits of information. This book could not have been written without them, thanks especially to Hugh Lowe, Brian Tuffus, Keel Toulis, Brenda Marmon, Pete Clouston, Jane Grey, Dina Gollett, Kit Kennard, Margaret Bertrudis, Mel Lyon, Tony Wheatley, and Jylyn Pennard. Although I could not tell each other's prisoners story in full, I hope their families know how instrumental their efforts were. Thank you also to Jacqueline Mollahan for her generosity in sharing her late husband Patrick's vast archive collection and research in the RFC and POWs in World War I. Despite such a huge number of sources, there remain some mysteries, particularly as to the arrival and departure times of some of the prisoners to Holzheim, and their specific activities in the early foundation of the tunnel. The tremendous archive tracking service of World War I POWs collected by the International Committee of the Red Cross was invaluable in solving some, but not all, of the prisoners' movements in and out of the camps. Still, there remained a few gaps. I have endeavored to draw as accurate a timeline as possible. Any errors or misinterpretations are mine alone. Much deserved, I would like to thank my publishing team. First, to my former Scholastic editor, Cheryl Klein, who gave me that little extra nudge at the critical time to pursue this story. Then to Nick Thomas, who brought his wonderful insight and editing skills to help me craft this story for young readers. Second, to my agent and friend, Eric Lupfa, who has always been there for steady guidance and cheerful encouragement. This book could not have happened without him. Thanks to my film agent on project, Ashley Fox, as well as the great folks at WME, Simon Treen, and Raphael de Angelis. I also benefited read from World War I aviation experts, James Streckfuss. As always, an appreciation and support to all my Scholastic and support of all of Scholastic, including Sin O'Day and the great Arthur Lewin. This book is dedicated to my longtime editor, Luz Hudson. We've been together now on a decade and a half, and to be honest, I simply do not know what I would do without you. At my side every step of the way. Thank you for your patience, insight, and crack of the whip, but with kindness. Sometimes I may not show it, but I know how lucky I am. Finally, to Diane and our girls, and Mose thrown in for good measure, words cannot do justice in describing your impact in every part of my life. And everyone, that is The Great Escape. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, everyone. I don't know what I would have done without this. Probably would have just never read this book. I tried reading it before, but never got to it. So now, thank you, everyone. This book was edited by Nick Thomas and designed by Maeve Norton, with photo research by Sin O'Day. The text was set in Legacy Serif ITC, with display type set in Ogovia Imperial Agency. Jerry Fogo oversaw this production. This book was printed and bound by R.R. Donnelly in Crossfield, Indiana. The manufacturing was supervised by Valley Clovis. And everyone, that is The Grand Escape. I thank you. Thank you all for listening, and I am grateful. I have a community who wants to listen. Even if it might just be 2 or 3 people watching, I'm glad that you guys decided to watch. I hope every single one of you have an amazing day, and I hope you all are able to achieve your dreams and aspirations. Without further ado, This is the Calm Reader, signing off. Bye bye.